Hello, good afternoon and welcome to The Law. On the occasion of the United Nations International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which is observed November 2 every year, we invite you this afternoon to join us to discuss the subject of attacks on journalists, particularly as we go into the elections. I'll introduce my guest to you shortly. We'll be right back. You're welcome back. This is The Law, and I'm your host, Samson Ladi Anyanini. This afternoon, my guest, Justice Sramsai, is lecturer. He teaches the law at the Gimpa Law Faculty. Thank you, Justice, for making the time to join us.
Thank you very much, Samson.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your award last week.
Thank you, sir. Also joining us via Zoom is George Sapom. He is Executive Secretary of the National Media Commission. He's also a lawyer. Thank you for making the time to join us, sir.
Thank you very much, Samson.
Great.
And again, congratulations for making all of us proud and for your services to the Ghanaian society.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start with you from the perspective of where you sit as Executive Secretary of the NMC. Having come to know you, you are sought after in the region and in the world when it comes to issues of the media, and questions of the safety of journalists has been an issue that you, the NMC, have engaged on it as well. First of all, generally speaking, how concerned are you about the safety of journalists going into the 2020 December elections?
And thanks for your kind words. I think there are two key things I need to say. Number one is that there's been considerable progress in securing the safety of the citizens within the democratic polity, generally speaking, including journalists, but there are significant concerns. And as you have written about, our friends at the Media Foundation for West Africa, for example, has done comprehensive documentation of how media are treated generally, and also we know the intense periods of electioneering. And I think that whilst progress has been made in the area of the safety of journalists, significant concerns exist about what we need to do further to improve the situation.
How does it come to you that when you look at the record of the Media Foundation for West Africa, and that is the numbers of journalists who have reported and the Media Foundation for West Africa has recorded, we do not know about those whose cases may not have been reported. How does it come to you that even security officers appear to be the worst violators? As many as 30 of them out of the 70 plus incidents recorded by the Media Foundation for West Africa from 2016 to today.
It saddens but does not surprise me. And the sadness is with respect to the fact that after all these years and of improvement in our governance and democracy, we still see these things. It does not surprise me, partly because the security agencies themselves are in a certain kind of transition. Samson, remember that we are barely, 3 decades old when we moved away from security as a brawn issue to what we are seeing as a brain issue. Traditionally, even recruitment into every security service across Africa was based more on the personal force that the individual came with than the brains. Remember that the security services had been put together essentially as a force for the protection of the powerful and the rulership class rather than a service. In the last couple of years, we have seen the security services, whether it is the police or the military or any one of them, moving consistently towards improving their dealings with the citizens and therefore adopting a service orientation. But it is the entire society that is in transition. And so you will still have these vestiges of oppression and repression all over. Just take a casual view of how our society and state is structured. Samson, if you enter every public place in Ghana, the first sign of oppression that you see is that even when the gate is constructed in two swings, one level is permanently closed. And then we open just one door to force everybody in. And it's a metaphor for the constrained orientation that all of us at the state and as a society has put ourselves through. In other words, almost everything we do in this country seeks to constrain rather than to free the citizens and the society. So I'm not surprised that we still have a security service or a security security service where significant numbers still see themselves as a force rather than as a service, and will act in ways that are certainly unacceptable. But let me also indicate that I still hope that as we progress, we can work together for every sector of society to understand that we are better off as a free, democratic, open society than as a constrained society. Just one small quick point is also to say that not to hold brief for the security agencies, it seems to me that the way we do our work, and that's going to be a very small percentage, sometimes the way we approach our work puts us too much in the line of danger in the way we relate to the security. Going forward, it seems to me that a certain approach that enables us to understand the security forces, that whilst they work to understand our work, will benefit the society greatly. Thank you.
This specific situation, for a general commentary, there was a reporter who saw a group of police officers parked in the bucket of a pickup, a police vehicle in Kumasi, and he took pictures. So whilst he was taking the photographs, they stopped and got down, ordered him to bring his equipment, delete the footage that he had captured, and manhandled him. Did he do any wrong, seeking to tell a story of police officers actually violating the laws of the country by parking themselves in the bucket of a pickup in the public?
Clearly, Samson, these were errant security people who were seeking to conceal their misbehavior by obliterating the evidence against their behavior. Because without that evidence, it is most likely that they would lie to their own superiors if this issue came up. Let us remind our viewers and listeners about the key principle in media and public engagement. The principle is that one is entitled to see through the media whatever you are entitled to see if you were at the market square. So if I were by the roadside and I could have seen these policemen in the bucket, then I'm entitled to see that through the media because it is reality. Okay? The only reason why sometimes errant security people, as I have said, will do this is simply because they want to conceal evidence of their misbehavior. But because the traditional orientation of security services is one of force, they misapply the force in their own protection for their own self-interest against their own bad behavior. But that certainly cannot be accepted.
Right. I'd like to begin on that same note with you, Justice, and add this scenario. And it's a true situation, and we sued. And when we sued, the court said that if a media person comes onto the premises, it's a public place, those who have the responsibility for that premises have a duty to protect that media person. Now, this is what happened. People have sent in messages complaining that they had difficulty renewing their national insurance ID card, if you like, licenses. Now, the journalists went to one of these offices where the registration and renewal was going on, and there was a queue that was milling onto the street. So he stood in there and began to ask some of the, people who had come there what the problem was. And of course, they were not happy. So they were telling him their story. Somebody came out of the office, accosted the gentleman. Eventually, he was beaten up. Efia Pokua, I'm talking about, was actually pushed into a gutter, a ditch. And she suffered, some injury. We took the matter to court, and the authority came to explain that the person who did the act is not an officer, and they do not know him. The court still went ahead to make the judgment that once the journalist was on that premises, which was a public place, they had a duty to protect the journalist. How is that?
Thank you, Samson. I think the court was exceedingly right in coming to that conclusion, and let me explain why. The right to information is also the foundation for journalism.
Okay.
Every citizen is entitled to have information as much as possible. And this right has a corresponding duty, which duty lies on the state. So if you look at the International Human Rights Instrument from the Universal Declaration through the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, through many other resolutions of the UN, the principle runs through that the state has an obligation to aid the media. And so if there's a public space or a public place where there is an event going on, that automatically falls under the ambit of the states to control. Then, therefore, the judge's decision that it is the responsibility or the duty lies on whoever is occupying that space to protect the journalist, then is right. So let me break down the nature of the state's obligation.
Okay.
Often we assume that the state, if the state itself does not do the thing or does not perpetrate the violence against the journalist, then the state is okay. But that is not the position of the law. The law is that the state, first of all, has a duty not to perpetrate violence. It has a duty not to expose the journalist to violence. It has a duty to actually, protect the journalist. That is to provide all the necessary means for the journalist's work. It has a duty then to punish whoever commits this violence or perpetrates this violence against the journalist. And also the duty to provide other remedies to the journalist. So that position of the law, which the judge said, is well grounded, not just in the international law, but also under our domestic law. So if you read through our laws, especially the Constitution, that same language which you find in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the same language is seen through all from Chapter 5 to the chapter on the protection of the media. So I think it's time we began to understand that being a state is not, the duty is not to just avoid doing the violence, but also to be active in preventing it, in punishing it whenever it's done, and also providing the other remedies that come with it.
In this scenario I gave, the officers of the National Health Insurance, their position was that the journalists came to the place and ought to have sought their permission before engaging with the people who had come there to seek their service. The journalists didn't. And they said that was wrong. He ought to have sought their permission. You take that against this journalist who was standing by the roadside, and not too long ago, some reporters of the Ghana News Agency suffered a similar thing right here at Kimbu, the Kimbu area, where an event was going on because some security officers were engaged with some other people, and they decided to take photographs of them, and they got angry. And they said, you can't take that. You need our permission to do that.
You know, first I'll take it from two perspectives.
Right.
I'll assume that they need the permission to do that. And then the second one would be, I will take out the assumption, which would be that they don't need the permission.
All right.
Granted that the requirement is for them to first seek permission. Is it the argument that the punishment for not seeking permission is extrajudicial beating?
Okay.
Clearly, that is not the punishment. There should be, even if the law is that you should seek permission, there should be a procedure for punishing the breach of that law. Yep. Now, on the second hand, which is that once it is a public space, there is no obligation on a journalist to say, to ask for permission before they start. Otherwise, what is the essence of even being a journalist? If you have to ask permission, which also means that the permission could be withheld. And so then the journalist's work, which is supposed to be independent, and whose freedom is guaranteed by the Constitution, is now subject to some administrative officer who may not even be high-ranking anywhere to determine whether the journalist can do his or her work. So clearly, the requirement for permission in public places is not grounded in law, as far as my understanding goes.
Yeah, right.
However, there may be certain situations where you may need what we call. So one of the things which maybe we'll come to that later in election, the issue of accreditation, and we'll come to that probably later in the discussion. But there is no inherent requirement that when a journalist wants to do his or her work in a public space, he needs to look for whoever is in charge and ask for permission. That is actually contrary to the freedom and the independence of the media, which is guaranteed under the Constitution.
Right. Let's hear. So, Mr. Sarpong, you teach journalists how to do their work and do it safely. If in these two situations that I gave, is it not in the interest of the journalists to secure their safety by seeking permission to avoid this situation? And most of the times, we know that the violations happen because of questions of permission. In a more recent situation, Hajia Fati at the MPP's headquarters she claims, mistook a journalist for an onion seller. And she said the journalist was taking or recording a scuffle right in her face, and she did not ask permission before she recorded what was going on at the premises. The court disagreed with her, both at the criminal level and also at the civil level, and slapped fines on her. But is it not in the interest of the journalists for their safety to try and seek permission even in what you may call a public place? And justice will help us to better define a public place, and whether or not in the case where security officers are involved, they are entitled to say, bring your recorder or your equipment and let's delete what you have recorded and let you go free.
Okay. So, Samson, the permission in the context of journalism is simply a lifting of control to enable you to do something. Okay. So, if you apply that principle, ask yourself, the people that Efia Pukwa went to speak to, were they under the control of the National Health Insurance officers? You understand? These are individuals who have come for a service. Their decision to seek a public service does not make them slaves of that service provider. Neither does it lift their right to their own self-control, self-dignity, and their humanity. You understand? So it is very insulting to begin with to want to treat somebody like, excuse my language, a goat or a sheep that has strayed into your yard. That you say, in order to rescue that, because it is in your yard, I require your permission. You understand? For as long as I'm dealing with a human being who controls his or her own life and does not live or operate under your authority, I do not need you to lift any control over that person before I can engage with that person. As simple as that. The second thing is only to re-emphasize the point that Justice has so brilliantly said. It is important that we remind all those public officers that even if this was not a public place, a broader understanding of the legal principles of occupier liability, which enjoins an occupier of every premises to secure safety for any user or entrant, applies to them as well. And so the moment somebody enters into your premises, the safety of that person becomes a certain responsibility that you bear. Now, regarding permission, the question of permission comes, as I have said, when something is directly under your control and you will be held liable or responsible for an abuse of that. So let us say public records. You are a public officer, you are entrusted with public protection of the records. If somebody enters the premises without your permission, it will be difficult to distinguish between a lawful user or a thief, a destroyer, or a burglar. So in the context of that, permission is necessary and may be required.
Right.
You understand?
Right.
Outside that, the question of permission does not arise.
Okay. And so in that circumstance, the court gave an illustration like Judge Sapon had just said, and said, but if that is not available, then the journalist is allowed, even according to their code, to use other means, including, like some people would say, subterfuge, to gain access to the information for the purposes of the public. So now let's come to the question. Where is a public place? And he defines it in a very easy way for all of us to understand, where there is an obligation to give permission or to seek permission. And when can someone say, you have already recorded some material, bring your equipment, let's delete it, or we seize your equipment. If you don't delete it, you are not going.
Okay, so public place and private places. So a public place generally would be considered as a place where the general public is allowed to access. Sometimes it goes with the ownership of the place, but most often ownership is ignored, and the question is the general public allowed to come to the place? So for example, if I have a hotel, it may be my private property, but to the extent that people are generally allowed to enter the hotel, it becomes one way or the other a public place. So I'm trying to simplify, you know, the very complex concept.
Right.
If it is a private place, for example, your home, then even the Constitution protects that kind of, you know, space. And in that case, then it is a private place. So generally, we may say that public place is a place where the public generally is allowed to enter. Now, back to the issue of permission. Let's make a distinction between, again.
But even in the private place, where the Constitution protects in Article 18, 18.2 says that if there are conditions by which that protection can be breached lawfully, correct?
Yeah, there are conditions.
When there is crime or there is issues of, as it were, morals and health, such matters, the privacy can be breached.
Yes, that again, I don't understand that provision to mean that you can breach the privacy in the hope of finding a crime, or hope of finding. So there are requirements. First of all, there should be a law, you know, allowing for the breach of that privacy, and there should be procedures to follow. Okay. So the fact that the privacy right is subject to exception, for example, crime, doesn't mean that I can just start violating the privacy of the person with the hope that I will find an evidence of crime or something going on. Now back to what I was saying about the private actors and then state actors. So let's say non-state actors. Generally, I think journalists don't have much problems with private actors.
Okay.
Because a private actor, if he violates a journalist's right, the journalist can directly proceed against the person, make a police complaint or even civil complaint against the person and get a remedy, which the law provides. The challenge is with state actors. And here we are talking of state actors. There are those who are directly state actors. So for example, a policeman in uniform is a direct state actor. A head of department of NHIA or NHIS or something, they are all direct private actors. But there is this gray area between private actors and non-private actors. So for example, an agent of let's say, a political party in government.
Right.
Okay. Whose agents during the political campaign are attacking, a journalist.
Right.
It will be difficult to say that person is a private actor. The reason is that he derives his legitimacy from someone who holds a public office. So even though he himself may not directly be a private actor, it is his source of authority or legitimacy is flowing directly from some public state actor, for that matter. So the point I'm trying to make is that when these issues happen, it is easy for, like in the case you narrated, for the official to say, well, he's not even one of our employees.
Right.
But again, like George said, he's within your space and he's using your space and actually citing you as a basis for his behavior, or let me call it misbehavior. So therefore, we need to. I think the general view should be that when you see a journalist who clearly either identify himself as such, you have no legitimate, purpose or basis to cause violence or attack or. What do I call it?
The journalists hold, a good number of them hold a general view that because these are law enforcement agencies, police officer, a military officer, they literally sort of put you under arrest. When they say you have done the wrong and they say bring your equipment and let's delete it or else you will not be left. A recent incident, Della Russell Okru, she had gone to a church premises because a group of people wanted to demonstrate against a pastor for certain comments that the pastor had made. She goes there, the incident is over, she gets into the church itself, and there is a church service going on, and people are doing certain things. And she's trying to take, cover it. She's forced and asked to surrender her equipment, to delete them, and so on and so forth. Is that not the same way that police can arrest someone and say, this is evidence we are taking from you, and so why don't they have a right over the equipment?
Yes, you see, they don't have the right because, first of all, it is a private property. Whatever the journalist is using, the gadget, is for the journalist or a private media house or a media house. You do not violate, the Constitution protects not only the privacy of the person, but also the property of the person. So if you are a police officer and in your work, assuming that you are doing a legitimate work, you seize someone's gadget, you have no further authority to by yourself decide what to do with the gadget as far as the content or its form is concerned. And we were in court some years ago and the decisions will tell you that once you have custody of the gadget, having access to it to alter or do anything with its content is beyond your control. You need to go to court. In fact, there is even a more radical decision by the Supreme Court where Justice Vuche made it clear that to violate someone's privacy means first judicial blessing. You need to obtain a warrant from the court to violate the privacy. So even when you are bringing yourself under the exceptions of preventing a crime or public safety, whatnot, the law is that as much as possible, you need judicial blessing first before you do that. So it is completely wrong for a police officer, no matter the rank, to collect someone's gadgets, whatever the person is doing, whether committing a crime or not, and instantly, delete, alter the gadget, either in form or in content in any way. And that is even for general people.
Right.
So you can imagine for a media person or journalist whose right is protected by the Constitution specifically.
Right. So I'll return to you to tell us what a journalist should do in that circumstance, where they are told, either by police or whatever individuals they are, that they should surrender their gadgets and proceed further to delete whatever is on it so that they can gain their freedom. But, Mr. Sarpong, if we are dealing with an errant journalist, so there are people who say, but we caught the journalist doing some wrong. Why are you saying we do not have the right to discipline that journalist?
The most important thing is that, as Justice has so rightly analyzed, there are legal remedies for any kind of wrongdoing in a democratic society. So in our context, the law sets out clear options for anybody who thinks that the journalist has misbehaved. You have an opportunity to complain to the National Media Commission. If the person is a member of any of the professional associations, you can choose to complain to them. You can complain to the media house where the person works. If you think that the person's act is criminal, you can report the person to the police, okay, for proper investigations and not to manhandle. But ultimately, the courts are also there for you to seek any kind of redress that you feel you want to seek. But before we advance further, I thought that if you wouldn't mind, I would make some quick comment on the beautiful analysis about the public place question.
Please
that Justice has really helped us to understand. Let us again point out that it's a very complex issue. And the journalist taking a decision always needs to weigh a number of things. So let me follow on from the brilliant point Justice made, using the example of the hotel. The best practice is that you need to combine a certain number of elements. It's a person and place analysis. Public person, public place, okay? Private person, private place, and the gray areas. So when we talk about a public place, as he said, any place that is ordinarily available for any member of the public to use, even if it requires the payment of a fee, would ordinarily be considered a public place. However, if you took any place that is also understood generally to be for private use, it's a private place. So if you took a hotel, whilst the lobby of the hotel would be a public place, if an individual retreated to their room, the room would not be a public place. Okay? If there is a park or some gardens attached to the hotel, that would be a public place. Again, that may not necessarily apply to if a hotel or a restaurant, for example, has an open place for use, but also reserves some private place. If somebody made a reservation for a private place for his or her family, that may not necessarily be open to intrusion by others. So one needs to keep those nuances. Now, when it comes to the person and the person analysis, from a media perspective, anybody who throws himself onto the vortex of public opinion becomes a public person. Not necessarily a person employed by the state. So if you're within the church establishment where you seek to proselytize any kind of faith, you automatically place yourself within the public space. And to the extent that there are no formal restrictions about who can attend your church, the church then becomes a public place. So if somebody comes into the church, you ought to be extremely careful how you deal with the person. So let us do this, and we're on TV, but let us attempt a quadrant. Anytime you are in doubt, check where and who is involved. Where it is a public person in a public place, it is safe for coverage. If it is a private person in a private place, it's a red area. You've got to be extremely careful. If it is a public person in a private place, as you said, unless there is crime, immorality, or anything regarding the use of public resources, you want to be extremely careful. If it is a private person in a public place, again, it's a safe area depending on the judgment of the journalist.
Right.
So while these don't really delimit the lines very clearly, one can always use this as a guide. But coming back to the question that you asked me, under no circumstance, absolutely under no circumstance, is anybody allowed to manhandle a journalist or anybody else simply because you think that the person has come into an environment or has recorded anything they don't like. Again, coming back to justice, the remedy for trespass of any kind does not lie in physical attack.
Okay. That's a very pregnant statement. The remedy for justice does not lie in physical attack. Going into the elections and knowing what you know, and I think every election year, your body, a constitutional body, tries to sensitize the media and even provide guidelines as to how to go about what they have to do. How should the media be conducting itself, journalists, when they go to cover the elections to avoid these situations? And how should all other people within the election, situation interact with journalists?
Okay. 3 key things I would suggest. Number 1 is that let all of us try as much as we can to work with the arrangements made by the Electoral Commission. And when I say arrangements made by the Electoral Commission, I'm specifically talking about the electoral rules as set by law, particularly CI 127, which clearly delineates for us who is in charge of what and what each person can do. You have already pointed out in one of your write-ups about the protection that one gets if you are accredited, for example, as a journalist. Going beyond that, any journalist within the general vicinity of a polling station or covering any kind of election is entitled to all the protections of the law. If anybody thinks that that journalist has done anything wrong, the person can resort to the law to seek remedy. Let me quickly add the second line, which is that to acknowledge the contribution of government, the Ministry of Information has been working with us closely to develop a framework and a mechanism for the safety and protection of journalists.
We have lost George Sapon on that line, but we will get him back to state the aspect okay. Mr. Sapon, we lost you when you were about to give us an important information about what government through the Ministry of Information is doing to assist in this area.
Yes, so we're working together very actively on the safety of journalists. The advantage in that is that the government itself through the ministry is taking a considerable lead role in ensuring that journalists are safe, and that where any threat on their safety comes from any element within the state, not only would the journalists, the media house, NMC, and journalist associations be involved, but that the government itself would be actively involved in seeking justice and whenever it is needed, sanctions for the perpetrator.
Thank you.
The third thing that we are working on is a technology-based system for tracking incidents and the events around the country, particularly on polling stations. And one of the things that we are hoping to do is that we will also be able to capture any incidents of attack against journalists. Lastly, one of the things that I see happen every day in our coverage is that when we go on the field, rarely as journalists do we provide backup to one another. You see a couple of journalists sometimes with cameras available. One cameraman is attacked. We are holding cameras at good distances where we can film what is going on, and we end up letting evidence pass. If we made security people and everybody else understand that attacking one cameraman or one journalist wouldn't help you because all of us are going to focus on building the evidence against you, it appears to me that anybody who attempts to attack a journalist will be very careful.
Thank you very much. And that's a strategy all journalists and media owners or people who have to do anything with the coverage of the elections as far as the media's participation is concerned must take note of. Don't do it single-handedly. Provide support for each other in a way to be able to preserve the evidence if wrong is being done against one journalist. So just as my question to you earlier was, we return to you to tell us now what a journalist should do when they find themselves in the circumstance that we spoke about. They are being asked that, we have seen you recording or taking a photograph or video of ABC or a particular circumstance. We are not happy about it. The only way you get your freedom is to delete it, surrender and delete it. What should they do? And when you are done, tell us what the journalists cannot do when they go to the field to cover the elections.
Thank you very much. When you are a journalist and you are caught up in such a situation, I think the best thing or the wise thing to do is not to engage in a tussle with the officer or the person who is doing what he's doing. I think you need to understand that at that place there's chaos and there's misunderstanding.
Right.
You probably are not the most fit person to handle such a situation. So for me, when you find yourself in such a situation, you quietly hand over the gadget to the police officer. What I won't encourage you to do is to unlock your gadget or personally delete whatever they are asking you to do. That I would advise that you refuse to do any of those. Once you've handed over the gadget to the officer, he ought to know, he knows or ought to know that he cannot access in the first place. And also that he cannot compel you to delete. So do not take, unless you want to do it voluntarily, fine, then you can go ahead and delete. But do not subject yourself to search orders because it's clearly an unlawful order. And it doesn't, obeying that order doesn't also prevent you from being assaulted anyway, because taking the gadget from you forcefully itself is the way of an assault. So the assault has already, commenced, and you do not help the person to harm you further by obeying such orders. Now, back to the issue of, I think it was about election.
Yes.
Yeah. Covering election procedures is always finding a fine tune between two rights. The right of the public to information, which is embodied in the journalist, and also the right to privacy of the persons who are exercising their franchise. Because, inherent in the right to vote is secret ballot.
Right.
So then the person who is voting or the public you are even seeking to protect has an inherent right to vote and vote in secret.
Right.
So then that is where we try to find the middle ground. So it's a question of transparency versus privacy. Now, if you go to any polling station, there is the booth where the secrecy of the ballot is actually, protected. So people don't vote in the public; they enter a particular booth and they vote. If you're a journalist, I think you have no business trying to zoom in and find out what the person is doing in the booth. That is protected by the law. Just as the law protects your right as a journalist, the freedom to do your work. Apart from the booth, I will assume that anything that is happening in the polling center is a public event.
Okay. And
a journalist is entitled to cover. Now, the issue of accreditation, which George has, nicely explained, it is necessary, to identify or to give accreditation for journalists to come, because clearly we know that at a certain, within a certain parameter, you are not entitled as an ordinary person to enter unless with the permission of the presiding officer.
That's right.
Now, that is where accreditation comes in. My prayer is that while we are giving this accreditation, we do not use criteria which end up excluding journalists.
Right.
The only reason why accreditation is needed is to promote journalism and to promote order. It has nothing to do with who can see what and who cannot see what. So then the procedures for giving accreditation should not be made so stringent and so difficult that certain media houses
will be excluded.
And here I'm even paying attention, apart from the established media, like the Joy FMs of this world, there are the new media. Right. So for example, if you take Kofi TV, for instance, those are not established media houses, but they have a lot of people who follow them. I don't think the accreditation, for instance, should be limited to the established media. Someone who is a blogger is also a journalist and ought to be given the same right. So while we can control the number of people within the perimeter and what goes on, I think it should not be a situation where we use accreditation as a means to limiting how many people or some media houses from performing this very good job.
Right.
Now,
let me just announce this, that you may be able to join us now. You have seen the Zoom ID and the password on your television screens. You can join us now with your questions. I have seen some very interesting questions coming up. Mr. George Sarpong and Justice Sramsai have answered some ahead of time, where you say the journalists have been hurting people. Journalists who do wrong. Yes, the point that just Mr. George Sarpong made was that you do not resort to physical attack or manhandling the journalist or any other person because you think they have done wrong. In this country, there's a way to treat people, deal with people who have done wrong. And that way is not by attacking them. So let's take note of that. But you can join us now with your questions or your contributions. Make sure you are always unmuting yourself before you speak. But if you come on ahead of time, mute yourself so that there are no interference. When I identify you, then you make your contribution or questioning and make it as quickly as you can. Yes, you are going to another point.
Yes, yeah. We've been talking about the challenges.
Right.
I just want to add some of the ways that we can overcome some of these challenges.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to the issue of elections and journalism. The problem we have been facing is usually because of lack of collaboration. If you take elections, for instance, there are about 4 institutions or 5 that must work together closely for us to have a transparent, free, and fair and successful election.
Right.
So you take the Electoral Commission is one, then you take journalists, they are one, you take political parties, the security services. Sometimes we wait too long in the day, and on December 7th, bring all these people together to start work, and that is where most of the violence comes out. We have 2 months or barely 2 months of the election, and I think we can start organizing conferences, workshop that will bring Electoral Commission, polling center officials or presiding officers together with security officials, party representatives, journalists, so that by the time we are by December 7th, these people would have met each other and would have explained some of these rules to themselves and would have done a lot of things to brush away some of these doubts and suspicions that we are always talking about.
Right.
And here I'm happy that George is around and he has what it takes. Let me assume he has what it takes to put together some of these workshops, some of these conferences for media houses. And when doing so, it shouldn't be limited again to the established media houses. Really, the established media houses, they even have some of the mechanisms of resolving some of these issues among themselves.
That's right.
More attention should be paid to the new media, the persons who are bloggers, who carry their phones as cameras and are broadcasting live, Facebook Live. We need to rope in those people as well, because trust me, and I'm not predicting doom, but a lot of the harm that will be happening in the election may be in respect of the new media. Now,
Mr. George Sarpong, law you refer to and say that we should all play by has a particular provision, and as a lawyer, I want you to tell us your view of this provision and whether or not it could create any problem, where it says that Regulation 30, it says keeping order at polling station. The presiding officer shall maintain order at the polling station assigned to the presiding officer. The presiding officer may authorize a security officer to immediately remove from a polling station a person who behaves in a manner to disrupt proceedings at the polling station or fails to obey the lawful orders of the presiding officer, and that person shall not be allowed to enter the polling station. Can there be a problem where the presiding officer is supposed to exercise this discretion and to direct a police officer or security officer to remove somebody from the place, and that could include a journalist?
Is problematic, but one can also understand the philosophy behind it. Perhaps going forward, what all of us need to do is to help the Electoral Commission to unpack certain concepts using the provision. One is polling station, okay? Within which vicinity of the polling station is the presiding officer presiding over. And for journalists, also deciding where else can I film or where else can I record the same phenomenon from? Where else can I observe the issue from? And then exactly what constitutes disruption in the context of our discussions, and whether or not legitimate journalistic work constitutes disruption. So it appears to me that we may have to deal with these things, but I completely agree with you that we need to deal with this. But if you permit me 2 quick comments. One would be to admit that Justice makes an excellent suggestion to us about, in our sensitization, who to include. And I think that it's an extremely useful point that I will keep. But before then, you had also asked Justice about what do you do in the circumstance where a security officer arrests you and says, delete material that you have recorded. Mm-hmm. Increasingly across the world, technology is offering us solutions that I would recommend to our media, particularly the companies that can afford them. It is so easy to set up your camera straight onto the clouds.
That's right.
So that whatever you are recording is immediately saving into the clouds. So if they order the deletion of material from your camera, it really does not help them much. Okay.
I get that.
And I think that the suggestion that we ought to take our personal securities seriously and to ensure that.
Okay, Judge Sapon temporarily frozen. I understand that there are many of you who want to join, but you are not muting, all of you. There's a lot of noise with your Zoom, entry to the discussion. So if you are joining, please make sure that you are muted, because there are too many of you and all of you have your microphones opened. That will bring a bit of a trouble. So please mute them. We will identify you one by one and ask you to come in, and then you can make your contribution. Thank you very much. And this has been the law, and we're discussing election coverage, ending media attacks. My guests are George Sapong, who is Executive Secretary of the National Media Commission. Justice Sramsai is lecturer, Gimpa Law Faculty, giving all of us some tips, including education on the law as to how to go about your work. Okay, so Mr. Sapong, if you can conclude the final point that you were making. Okay, we have lost your feed there. This question I was asking him, do you think it's likely to bring an issue? Because the presiding officer has a discretion to say you are disrupting and to make orders that he feels are lawful orders. and you must obey. If you don't obey, he will ask the police officer or whoever, security officer, to remove you from the place.
Yes, so like George said, you can understand the philosophy behind making giving that discretion to the presiding officer. And that is because you cannot have more than one captain on the ship.
Right.
So somebody must have the ultimate say in what happens.
Right.
But having said that, we need to understand that discretion should not just be, used because it's given. Most often we ignore how to control discretion. We just leave the provisions as it is, and then we tell presiding officer, you have the power to do this, and they assume that because they have the power to do this, they can do it the way they want.
Right.
This challenge can be overcome when we have workshops, conferences together to explain to them, to explain to the police officer that the fact that the presiding officer says carry someone out doesn't mean that you too, because you are not a tool. So we need to have this workshop, and we need to have manuals. Yeah. Sometimes we see the law like this, but we need to have manuals which will break down even the circumstances under which you may order someone to leave. It should be spelled in some document.
In a minute, the law says at the polling station is a presiding officer who has the duty for keeping order. So should I listen to anybody else, including a security officer, except the presiding officer?
No, the presiding officer will have the final say.
Okay.
What it means is that whenever there's a conflict between two people within the perimeter, the person who resolves that conflict immediately should be the presiding officer. So if a police officer says, leave, and you insist you won't leave, immediately the police officer must bring in the presiding officer to now resolve the issue by either upholding the police officer's orders or overturning it.
Right. Our time is gone, but I think somebody else, I think there's a clarity to one of the lines. Is it Mumuni? Yes, Mumuni, let's hear you. Mumuni, unmute.
Yes, all right. Good morning, good evening, or afternoon. Once again, and hello to my good lecturer, Justice. My question is this: what is the law regarding which has the potential of preventing a voter from voting? Have reported such a voter to the police officer.
Okay, you got that?
Yes, so I understand him to be asking that if I'm a voter, can the presiding officer just order police officer? First of all, you have your right to vote, which is protected.
Right.
But you need to vote by behaving in a certain way.
Right.
So if you are ordered to be carried away, I think the order should be such that it does not override your supreme right to vote.
Right.
So the presiding officer cannot or ought not exercise the power to disenfranchise people. The power is meant to be used to control orderliness, and the provision is clear on that to maintain what the side note is keeping order at the police station.
Right.
Unless your presence or your attempt to exercise the power is in breach of these orders, you are entitled to vote.
And according to the law, once you put yourself in an orderly way, the presiding officer will allow you to come back to cast your ballot. And the fact is that the presiding officer only determines that I can allow so many people at one time, because it doesn't have to allow too many people to come into that particular place at one particular time. Otherwise, there will be chaos. It is not intended to frustrate anybody from being able to cast their vote. We have run out of time. Thank you so very much, Justice Fremsai, and also George Sapong. This has been your Legal Light and Help Law. This is the law. Thank you very much.